Imagine a puppy showing up on your doorstep, soaking wet from the rain. Now imagine finding a blood-stained message around its neck reading, "Help me, my owner is in danger." This isn't fiction. It's the incredible story that Officer Jake Sullivan faced on what should have been a routine patrol. As the tiny creature led him through dark alleys toward an abandoned house, Sullivan had no idea what waited inside would forever change his understanding of courage, desperation, and the lengths people will go to survive. The mystery behind this four-legged messenger holds a truth more shocking than anything he could have prepared for. A faint whimper pierces through the steady rhythm of rain, drawing Officer Sullivan's attention to something moving in the shadows. Jake Sullivan had been on the force for 15 years, and rainy nights like this one typically meant a quiet shift. Paperwork, routine patrols, and counting down the minutes until he could return to his empty apartment. At 42, the job had become as predictable as the weather in this small city. Tonight was supposed to be no different. The dashboard clock read 11:43 p.m. Jake was just 17 minutes from clocking out when he heard it. A sound so faint, he almost dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on his tired mind. But then it came again, more desperate this time, cutting through the hypnotic patter of raindrops on the cruiser's roof. He killed the engine and stepped out into the downpour, his hand instinctively resting on his holster as he scanned the darkened street. The security lights from the nearby convenience store cast long shadows across the wet pavement, creating a maze of darkness and dim illumination. And there, huddled against a dumpster, a small shape trembled. "Hello?" Jake called out, his deep voice softening as he realized what he was looking at. "Hey there, little one." The puppy couldn't have been more than a few months old, some kind of terrier mix with oversized ears that now drooped with the weight of the rain. Its light brown fur was matted with mud and what looked like brambles, clinging to its tiny frame like battle scars. Each labored breath created small clouds in the cold night air as the creature stared up at Jake with eyes that seemed too knowing, too desperate for such a young animal. Protocol dictated he should call animal control, let them handle it in the morning. The puppy wore a collar. It belonged to someone. Jake had paperwork waiting, a shower calling his name, leftover takeout in the fridge. But something about those eyes. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" Jake murmured, crouching down, rain soaking through his uniform pants at the knees. The puppy's legs were caked with mud up to its belly, its paws raw and bleeding in spots. Whatever journey this small creature had undertaken, it hadn't been easy. Jake's mind cycled through the possibilities. A runaway pet that had wandered too far from home, abandoned by someone who couldn't care for it anymore. Either way, leaving it out here wasn't an option. Not in this weather, not in this condition. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wrapper from his dinner sandwich. "Not much of a peace offering, but it's all I've got." The puppy flinched as Jake extended his hand, those expressive eyes darting between his face and the offering, weighing trust against survival. Jake remained perfectly still, rain streaming down his face, each second stretching into an eternity of silent negotiation. Then, with a tentative step forward, the puppy closed the distance between them. It sniffed Jake's fingers, then licked tentatively at the wrapper, before collapsing against his hand, as if the last reserve of strength had finally given out. "It's okay, buddy. I've got you now," Jake whispered, gently scooping the trembling animal into his arms. The puppy didn't resist. Instead, it pressed itself against his chest, seeking warmth and safety in the arms of a stranger. It was then, as Jake carefully adjusted his hold on the fragile creature, that his fingers brushed against something metallic. The collar. Standard issue, nothing fancy. But the tag attached to it was unlike anything Jake had seen before. Not a professionally engraved identification disc, but a crude piece of metal, its surface scratched with jagged letters that caught the dim light as he turned it. His breath caught in his throat as he read the message. "Help me. My owner is in danger." Jake's eyes darted up and down the empty street, suddenly seeing the shadows not as harmless pockets of darkness, but as potential hiding places. The puppy whimpered again, but this time Jake heard it differently, not just as a cry for help, but as a messenger carrying a desperate plea. "Who did this to you?" he murmured, examining the tag more closely. The scratches were deep, deliberate, made by someone with shaking hands but clear intent. This wasn't a prank. Someone had transformed this small creature into their last hope for rescue. Jake stood, cradling the puppy against his chest as his training kicked in. His mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. A domestic violence victim unable to escape? A kidnapping? Someone trapped or held against their will with no means of communication except this desperate gambit? He reached for his radio, hesitated, then keyed it anyway. "Dispatch, this is Officer Sullivan. I've got an unusual situation here." "Dispatch, this is Officer Sullivan. I've got an unusual situation here." The static that followed felt deafening as Jake waited, his attention returning to the crude metal tag between his fingers. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter, each droplet catching the dim glow of the streetlight as they washed over the collar's surface. That's when he noticed it, a subtle crimson streak that shouldn't have been there. "Sullivan, copy. What's your situation?" The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, but Jake had become transfixed by what the rain was gradually revealing. His thumb carefully traced the edge of the collar, feeling something woven into its fabric, not part of the original design. A slender ribbon, partially embedded in the worn material, held an unmistakable reddish-brown stain that his experienced eye instantly recognized. Blood. And not just a casual nick or scrape, the saturation suggested something far more serious. The puppy whimpered, pressing its trembling body against Jake's leg as if understanding the gravity of what he'd discovered. He gently stroked its head with one hand, while his other carefully rotated the collar, mindful not to disturb potential evidence. "Dispatch, I've found a puppy with unusual evidence attached to its collar." He kept his voice steady, despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. "The tag has a distress message, and there appears to be blood on the collar itself. Fresh blood." Jake's mind raced through possibilities, each more concerning than the last. This wasn't some prank or misunderstanding. Everything about the situation, the puppy's physical state, the crude engraving, and now the blood, pointed to something genuinely dire. Someone in serious trouble had sent their only available messenger into the night. "Could you repeat that, Sullivan?" The dispatcher's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Did you say a message on a dog collar?" "Affirmative." Jake's response was clipped as he continued his examination. Under the collar's buckle, he found something else. Several dark hairs caught in the metal clasp that didn't match the puppy's lighter coat. Human hair. The realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through his uniform. "Sullivan, what's your 20? Do you need animal control dispatched to your location?" The puppy's anxious pacing had intensified, its focus repeatedly shifting between Jake and the direction from which it had appeared. Those expressive eyes seemed to hold a desperate urgency that transcended species. This wasn't just about finding the animal shelter. This creature was on a mission. "Negative on animal control," Jake responded, his decision crystallizing. "Request backup to my location. I believe we may have a person in immediate danger." He provided his coordinates, noting the skepticism in the dispatcher's acknowledgement. Standard protocol would have him wait for backup, secure the scene, file a proper report. But Jake knew the grim statistics. In abduction cases, every minute decreased survival chances. If someone had been desperate enough to send their pet as a last-ditch effort for help, time was not a luxury they could afford. He carefully examined the blood-stained ribbon again, noting its relatively fresh appearance. The blood hadn't fully dried or oxidized, suggesting it couldn't be more than a few hours old. Whoever was injured might still be alive, might still be waiting for help that only this small creature could summon. "Dispatch, I'm going to follow the puppy's trail. It appears distressed and keeps looking in a specific direction. Given the evidence, I believe it may lead to a victim." A beat of silence followed before the dispatcher responded. "Sullivan, protocol states you should wait for backup. ETA is approximately 12 minutes to your location." The puppy had begun tugging at his pant leg now, its determination unmistakable despite its diminutive size. Jake made his decision. "Copy that. I'll maintain radio contact, but I'm proceeding to follow the puppy. Someone went through extraordinary lengths to send this message. I don't believe they have 12 minutes to spare." Rising to his feet, Jake felt the weight of his decision. In 15 years of service, he'd developed an instinct for distinguishing genuine threats from false alarms. Everything about this situation screamed authentic danger. The deliberately embedded blood-stained ribbon wasn't just evidence of injury, it was a calculated addition, intended to convey the severity of the situation should the written message somehow be insufficient. "Understood, Sullivan. Backup is en route. Maintain radio contact and proceed with caution." The puppy's demeanor changed instantly, as if comprehending that Jake had committed to help. It darted several steps ahead, then looked back, clearly wanting him to follow. As Jake secured his flashlight and checked his weapon, a haunting question lingered. What kind of desperate situation would drive someone to entrust their only hope for rescue to a creature so small and vulnerable? The tiny messenger had transformed before Jake's eyes. The puppy's earlier terror had been replaced by a fierce, almost preternatural determination. What invisible thread connected this fragile creature to its owner, and what horrors had it witnessed that Jake was about to confront? Standing in the rain-slicked street, Jake faced a critical decision that would test the boundaries between protocol and instinct. Jake pulled his radio from his belt, his thumb hovering over the call button for a brief moment. Every fiber of his professional training told him to wait for backup before pursuing an unknown threat. But the urgent tug of the puppy at his pant leg conveyed a desperation that couldn't be ignored. "Dispatch, this is Officer Sullivan at Maple and 8th, he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I've encountered a situation that requires immediate assistance." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the static. "Go ahead, Officer Sullivan." Jake hesitated, knowing how his next words would sound. "I found a dog with a distress message on its collar indicating its owner is in danger. The animal appears to want me to follow it, requesting backup to my location." A beat of silence followed before the dispatcher responded, skepticism evident in her tone. "Did you say a dog with a message, Officer Sullivan?" "Affirmative," Jake replied, watching as the puppy pawed anxiously at the ground, its head swiveling between Jake and the direction it seemed desperate to lead him. "I know how it sounds, but I have reason to believe someone is in immediate danger. The collar contains evidence suggesting violence or injury." The dispatcher's sigh was audible through the radio. "All units are currently responding to the pileup on Highway 18. Earliest available backup is at least 12 minutes out." 12 minutes. Jake glanced at the puppy, which had begun circling frantically, releasing short, urgent barks. In his career, he'd learned that minutes, sometimes seconds, made the difference between life and death. The statistical decline in survival rates for victims increased with each passing moment. "Copy that," Jake said. "I'll maintain this position until—" Before he could finish his sentence, the puppy darted several feet away, then turned back with a sharp, insistent bark that cut through the night air like a knife. Its body language had shifted from pleading to commanding. A cold weight settled in Jake's stomach as he considered his options. Following the animal violated department protocol for responding to potential crime scenes. Without knowing what awaited him, Jake could be walking into an ambush or a trap. The scratched message and blood-stained ribbon could be elaborate bait, designed to lure a solitary officer into danger. It wouldn't be the first time criminals had used unexpected methods to isolate law enforcement. Yet something about the puppy's behavior defied explanation as a simple ruse. The raw pause, the exhausted state, the intelligent focus in its eyes. These weren't elements easily staged. If someone had orchestrated this scenario, they'd have needed to predict not only that the puppy would find help, but that it would find someone willing to interpret and act on the message. Jake's hand moved to his service weapon, checking that it was secure in its holster. The weight of it offered cold comfort against the uncertainties that lay ahead. The rain had intensified, droplets sliding down his face as he made his decision. "Dispatch, be advised I'm pursuing this lead. The subject appears to be in imminent danger. Track my position through GPS and direct backup to follow my location when available." "Officer Sullivan, protocol states—" "I understand protocol," Jake interrupted, watching as the puppy began trembling with urgency. "But I also understand that someone sent this animal to find help because they had no other options. I'm proceeding with caution, but I am proceeding." The dispatcher's reluctant acknowledgement came through as Jake clicked his flashlight on and secured his equipment. He'd volunteered for countless dangerous assignments throughout his career, but this one felt different, personal in a way he couldn't articulate. Someone had placed their last hope in this small, vulnerable animal, trusting that the world still contained people who would respond to a cry for help, no matter how unusual its form. "All right," Jake said softly to the puppy. "Show me where to go." The effect of his words was immediate and startling. The puppy's posture changed, its entire body seeming to vibrate with purpose. Without hesitation, it turned and began trotting down the street, pausing only to ensure Jake was following. As Jake fell into step behind his unlikely guide, rain pounded against the pavement, washing away footprints almost as quickly as they were made. The comfortable boundaries of his routine patrol had dissolved, replaced by a journey into unknown territory led by the most improbable of guides. Each step carried him further from safety and procedure toward a mystery that someone had been desperate enough to entrust to a creature barely larger than his hand. What awaited him at the end of this strange path? A trap? A tragedy? Or someone whose life hung by the thinnest of threads? A thread now carried forward by a determined puppy and the officer who chose to follow. Rain lashed against Jake's face as the puppy led him away from the safety of familiar streets and into the city's forgotten shadowlands. What the tiny creature displayed wasn't mere animal instinct. It was a single-minded determination that carried the weight of someone's life. Each purposeful step revealed an intelligence that seemed to transcend its physical limitations, as if the puppy understood exactly what was at stake. The streets grew narrower, the buildings taller and more neglected. Storefronts that once bustled with commerce now stood vacant, their windows either boarded up or shattered. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across crumbling infrastructure that the city had long abandoned to decay. This was the part of town that rarely appeared in tourism brochures, a place where police cruisers typically traveled in pairs. "Slow down, little one," Jake called softly as the puppy darted ahead, disappearing momentarily into darkness before re-emerging with an impatient whine. The sound echoed against brick and concrete, amplifying the emptiness surrounding them. When Jake hesitated at a particularly foreboding alley, the puppy doubled back, circling his ankles with urgent nudges, its eyes reflecting a desperate plea in the dim light. What struck Jake most wasn't just the puppy's unwavering sense of direction, but the way it constantly checked over its shoulder, ensuring he followed. Each time Jake slowed or paused to radio his location, the puppy would stop, turning back with a whimper that somehow communicated more urgency than words could have conveyed. For a creature so small, its presence commanded a remarkable authority. The downpour intensified as they ventured deeper into the industrial district. Abandoned warehouses loomed like silent sentinels, their facades scarred by neglect and vandalism. Water pooled in the uneven pavement, reflecting fragmented images of the urban decay above. The sound of distant traffic faded until all Jake could hear was the rhythmic patter of rain, his own cautious footsteps, and the soft panting of his four-legged guide. Jake's hand never strayed far from his weapon as they moved through this unfamiliar territory. Years of patrolling had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of danger, the sudden silence, the feeling of being watched from shadowed windows, the prickling awareness that they had crossed into territory where the law held tenuous sway at best. Yet tonight, the greatest sense of urgency came not from these environmental warning signs, but from the desperate mission of the tiny creature leading him forward. The puppy navigated the labyrinth with the confidence of someone who had traveled this path before. Despite its exhaustion, visible in its occasionally stumbling gait and labored breathing, it pressed onward with unwavering focus. How had this small being summoned such extraordinary strength? The question nagged at Jake as they passed beneath a fallen power line, its cables draped across their path like the discarded web of a monstrous spider. "You've been through hell to get here, haven't you?" Jake murmured, noting how the puppy's pace quickened at the sound of his voice. Despite its obvious fatigue, there was something almost supernatural in its determination, the kind that emerges only when faced with the most desperate circumstances. As they approached a cluster of abandoned apartment buildings, the puppy's behavior shifted dramatically. Its earlier methodical pace gave way to frantic energy, darting forward, then back, its ears pricked forward in high alert. The change was so stark that Jake found himself scanning their surroundings with renewed vigilance, sensing they were nearing their destination. In the distance, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation and decades of neglect, stood a three-story building that had once been someone's vision of affordable housing. Now, it was nothing more than a hollowed-out shell, its windows gaping like empty eye sockets in the rain-slicked darkness. The sight of it caused the puppy to freeze momentarily, a tremor visibly running through its small frame before it resumed its urgent pace. A chilling realization dawned on Jake as he watched the puppy's reaction. This wasn't just a random journey. This small creature had escaped from captivity. It had somehow managed to break free, navigate an unfamiliar and dangerous urban landscape, and seek out help with a message literally attached to its body. The puppy hadn't just found a random officer. It had embarked on a deliberate rescue mission, carrying its owner's desperate hope for salvation like a sacred burden. The mathematics of such an improbable journey staggered Jake's imagination. How many miles had this tiny being traveled? How many dangers had it evaded? How had it maintained such focused determination when larger, stronger creatures might have surrendered to exhaustion or fear? The answer could only be found in the transcendent power of loyalty, a bond between human and animal that had transformed this vulnerable puppy into a messenger of life and death. Suddenly, the puppy stopped. Its entire body tensed as it stared fixedly at a particular building at the end of a trash-strewn alley. Without warning, it erupted into a series of sharp, frantic barks that cut through the steady drumming of rain. The sound seemed impossibly loud coming from such a small creature, each bark carrying an unmistakable message. "We're here. This is the place. Hurry." The puppy's urgent barking died down to a low, throaty growl as they approached the decrepit structure that loomed before them. What remained of a once ordinary home now stood as a monument to abandonment, its facade ravaged by time and neglect, windows sealed with rotting plywood, and a yard surrendered to nature's reclamation. Yet something about this seemingly vacant shell contradicted its appearance of emptiness. Jake stood, momentarily frozen, rainwater cascading off his uniform cap as he studied the two-story Victorian. Though the structure appeared ready to collapse under its own weight, his trained eye caught subtle inconsistencies. The padlock on the front gate hung open. A section of the overgrown pathway showed signs of recent compression, the weeds bent but not broken. Most telling was the absence of the typical markers of true abandonment. No graffiti marked the walls, no evidence of squatters or drug users littered the property. "This is wrong," Jake muttered, unclipping his flashlight and sweeping its beam across the property. The light caught something unexpected: fresh tire tracks in the mud beside the house, partially filled with rainwater, but still clearly defined. Someone had been here recently, and they'd taken pains to park where the vehicle wouldn't be visible from the street. The puppy's behavior shifted dramatically. It darted toward the house, then back to Jake, its small body vibrating with urgency. Jake reached for his radio, keeping his voice low as he updated dispatch on his location. "Copy that, Sullivan," the dispatcher responded. "Backup still 10 minutes out." 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Jake's instincts screamed contradiction. Standard procedure demanded he secure the perimeter and wait, but every second might matter for whoever had sent this desperate messenger. Moving with practiced stealth despite his size, Jake approached the house from an angle that offered maximum cover. The puppy followed, its earlier frenzy now transformed into a focused intensity that seemed unnaturally aware. As they reached the side of the house, Jake spotted a cellar door, its padlock recently cut, the severed metal still shiny at the breakpoint. "Someone's cut their way in," he whispered, more to himself than to the puppy. "Or out." The rain masked their approach as Jake circled toward the back of the house. A warped wooden deck sagged beneath a door that hung slightly ajar, just an inch of darkness visible between door and frame. The puppy immediately bounded toward it, scratching at the weathered wood with unmistakable purpose. Jake gently pulled the animal back, signaling for quiet with a finger to his lips. Remarkably, the puppy complied, watching him with an unsettling intelligence as Jake pressed his ear against the gap. At first, there was nothing but the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Then, a sound so faint he might have imagined it. A soft thump followed by what could only be described as a muffled cry. Human. Female. Distressed. His decision crystallized instantly. Jake drew his service weapon, the weight familiar and reassuring in his hand. With his free hand, he carefully tested the door. It swung inward with surprising silence, revealing a kitchen frozen in time. Furnishings from another decade stood covered in dust, except for a narrow pathway across the linoleum floor where the dust had been disturbed by recent footprints. The air inside carried a stale heaviness, but beneath it lurked other scents. The metallic tang of blood, the acrid smell of fear, and something chemical he couldn't immediately identify. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an interior that confirmed his suspicions. While most of the house remained untouched for years, certain areas showed signs of recent activity, a modern padlock securing a door to what appeared to be a basement, fresh scratches around the doorframe, a single glass of water on the counter with condensation still beading on its surface. The sound came again, clearer now that he was inside. A whimper followed by a faint voice. "Help. Please." The words were barely audible, but they carried a desperation that resonated through the empty house. Jake's radio crackled, and he quickly muted it, not wanting to announce his presence. The puppy, which had been silently shadowing his movements, suddenly froze, its ears perked forward toward the basement door, its body completely still as if transformed into a statue. With methodical precision, Jake checked adjacent rooms, clearing them one by one according to his training. Each room stood vacant, trapped in a time capsule of abandonment, but the trail of subtle disturbances all led toward that locked basement door. Another cry filtered through the floorboards, weaker than before. The mathematical reality of survival statistics flashed through Jake's mind. Every passing minute decreased the chances of finding someone alive. The padlock was substantial. Breaking through would create noise, potentially alerting anyone else who might be in the house. But the voice was growing fainter. Jake made his decision. 10 minutes was too long to wait. Checking that his body camera was active and recording, he knelt beside the door, examining the lock. It was new but simple, the kind he could manipulate with the right tools. From his pocket, he retrieved the small lock-picking set he'd carried since his days in tactical response. The puppy watched his every move, its earlier frantic energy now channeled into an eerie stillness that felt almost protective. As Jake worked the tumblers, he noticed how the animal's gaze kept shifting between him and the stairs leading to the second floor, as if standing guard. The lock surrendered with a soft click, just as another sound emerged from below, a scraping noise followed by a thud. Someone was moving down there, and from the sound of it, they were restrained but fighting. That soft click might have unlocked more than just a door. It signaled the moment Officer Sullivan stepped from one reality into something far more sinister. The basement door swinging open released a wave of stale air that carried whispers of suffering upward. Sullivan held his breath, not just to avoid the stench, but as if his body instinctively knew that drawing in that air meant accepting the horror that waited below. Sullivan had entered countless homes during his career, some abandoned, some occupied by people in their darkest moments. But something about this place felt fundamentally wrong in a way that transcended his experience. The narrow beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing walls where water damage had peeled away decades-old wallpaper in long, curling strips that resembled flayed skin. With his service weapon steadied in a two-handed grip, Sullivan began the methodical process of clearing the main floor. Each doorway represented a potential threat, each shadow a possible ambush point. He maintained his tactical stance as he swept from the entryway toward what once had been a living room, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that hesitation could be fatal, but rushing could be worse. The puppy's demeanor had transformed completely. No longer the urgent guide pulling him forward, it now pressed against Sullivan's ankle, trembling slightly with each step. The animal's eyes darted nervously toward the darkest corners, as if aware of dangers that human senses couldn't detect. Sullivan found himself drawing strange comfort from the warm presence against his leg, a reminder that he wasn't completely alone in this unsettling space. In the kitchen, Sullivan's flashlight beam caught something that sent a chill through him. A calendar hung on the wall, yellowed and faded with age, except for one detail. The current date was circled in fresh red ink. Someone had been here not just recently, but today, marking time in a house that otherwise seemed abandoned for years. Next to the sink, a half-eaten protein bar wrapped in modern packaging sat atop decades of dust, the incongruity jarring and deliberate. Moving toward what appeared to be a study, Sullivan noticed something else disturbing. The layer of dust covering most surfaces was interrupted by clean paths, evidence of regular movement through the house, but only along specific routes. Someone had been living here, but in a calculated, controlled way, as if trying to minimize their footprint or maintain the illusion of abandonment. In the study, Sullivan found the first concrete evidence that confirmed his worst fears. A desk drawer, partially open, revealed a collection of zip ties, cut lengths of rope, and a roll of duct tape with several pieces freshly torn from it. His stomach tightened as professional detachment battled with human revulsion. These weren't items forgotten by previous occupants. These were tools of constraint and control, positioned for easy access. Even more disturbing was the Polaroid photograph tucked beneath them. Sullivan carefully extracted it without touching the subjects. A young woman, her expression blank with terror, sitting against a wall that matched the basement Sullivan was about to enter. The timestamp in the corner indicated it had been taken just 3 days ago. Behind the desk, Sullivan discovered a small monitor displaying a screensaver of scrolling text. System armed. When he moved the mouse beside it, the screen changed to reveal a series of camera feeds, each showing different angles of the house's exterior, including a clear view of the front walkway where Sullivan had entered. With cold certainty, he realized that his presence was likely already known to whoever controlled this system. Most chilling was the empty chair in front of the monitor, indented with the shape of someone who had sat there recently. The surface of the desk held an empty coffee mug, still warm to the touch when Sullivan carefully placed his fingers near it. Whoever had been monitoring the cameras might have left minutes before Sullivan arrived, or perhaps they had seen him coming and moved elsewhere in the house. A small cabinet below the desk contained even more disturbing items. A sophisticated voice recorder with several labeled tapes, a medical kit containing sedatives rather than first aid supplies, and a notebook filled with meticulous observations in cramped handwriting. Sullivan flipped through just enough pages to recognize it as a journal documenting someone's captivity. Hours of sleep, meals accepted or rejected, behavioral responses to various stimuli. The clinical detachment of the notes suggested a mind that viewed human suffering as data to be collected. As Sullivan absorbed the implications of what he'd found, a sound from below broke the silence. A distinct metallic scrape, like something being dragged across a concrete floor. The puppy's ears immediately perked up, its body going rigid with attention. Then came another sound, unmistakably human. A muffled voice, too faint to make out words, but clear enough to convey desperation. Sullivan moved toward the basement door with renewed urgency, the puppy close behind. The stairs descended into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. Unlike the calculated disorder of the upper floor, the stairwell was immaculately maintained, the handrail wiped clean, the steps recently swept. This was the path most frequently traveled by whoever controlled this house of horrors. At the bottom of the stairs, Sullivan's light caught a gleam of something that didn't belong in an abandoned house. The modern lens of a high-definition security camera mounted in the corner, its red recording light blinking steadily. Someone was watching, perhaps even now. The knowledge that unseen eyes might be tracking his movements added a new dimension of danger to an already volatile situation. Sullivan wasn't just racing against time to find a victim. He was potentially being studied by a predator who now knew exactly where he was. The blinking red eye of the security camera wasn't the only thing watching Officer Sullivan in that basement. A presence lurked in the shadows, one that sent chills down his spine despite the warm, stagnant air. Sullivan's flashlight beam cut methodical paths through the darkness, revealing a space that defied the neglected appearance of the floors above. The basement had been transformed into a meticulously organized prison. One corner contained a bare mattress, stained with substances Sullivan didn't want to identify. Beside it sat a plastic bucket, toilet facilities for someone without the freedom to leave. A metal water bowl, the kind meant for pets, lay overturned nearby. Most disturbing was the wall adjacent to the mattress, where 5 neat rows of tally marks had been scratched into the concrete. 26 days, Sullivan whispered, counting quickly. 26 days of captivity in this underground hell. Unlike the dusty disarray upstairs, this space showed signs of regular cleaning, not for comfort, but for preservation. The concrete floor had been recently mopped, leaving faint streaks still visible in Sullivan's flashlight beam. A drain in the center of the room explained how the space was maintained with such clinical efficiency. Sullivan moved deeper into the basement, the puppy now practically glued to his heel. The light suddenly caught on something that didn't belong, a single harsh spotlight mounted to the ceiling, currently switched off, but positioned directly over a metal chair bolted to the floor. Leather restraints hung from the armrests and legs. A small metal cart beside it held an array of implements that made Sullivan's stomach twist. "Police officer! Is anyone down here?" Sullivan called out, keeping his voice authoritative despite the horror tightening his throat. His words seemed to hang in the air, absorbed by the thick concrete walls. Then, a sound. A faint rustling from the darkest corner of the room, beyond the reach of his flashlight. Sullivan swung the beam toward the noise, revealing a sight that stopped him cold. A young woman huddled against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest. Her wrists were bound with zip ties that had cut into her skin, dried blood caking around the plastic. Her dark hair hung in matted clumps around a face swollen with bruises in various stages of healing. Her eyes, when they finally lifted to meet his, held both terror and disbelief. The puppy erupted into whimpers, straining toward the woman with such force that it nearly pulled itself off its feet. Sullivan approached slowly, holstering his weapon but keeping it within easy reach. "I'm Officer Sullivan with the police department," he said, his voice gentler now. "I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She stared at him as if he were a mirage that might vanish at any moment. Sullivan knelt several feet away, maintaining enough distance not to overwhelm her. "Your puppy found me," he explained, gesturing to the little dog now wiggling with increasing desperation. "Smart little guy led me right to you." At the mention of the puppy, something flickered in the woman's eyes, a spark of recognition cutting through the haze of fear. Her gaze shifted to the small dog, and her entire body seemed to tremble. "Max?" she whispered, her voice so raw it barely carried through the room. Sullivan gently released his hold on the puppy's collar, and the little animal bolted toward its owner. The reunion that followed brought a lump to Sullivan's throat. The woman buried her face in the puppy's fur, silent sobs shaking her shoulders as the little creature licked frantically at her face and neck, tail whipping back and forth in frenzied joy. Sullivan used the moment to radio his position, keeping his voice low as he requested immediate medical assistance. When he turned back, the woman was watching him, still clutching the puppy to her chest. "My name is Grace," she managed, each word clearly painful to form. "He'll be coming back. He always comes back at midnight." Sullivan checked his watch. 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes. "We're getting you out of here right now," he assured her, moving closer to examine her restraints. The zip ties required cutting tools he carried in his utility belt. As he worked, Grace began to speak in broken sentences. "I was walking Max, 3 blocks from my apartment. He came out of nowhere, had a van, said he'd shoot Max if I screamed." Her words dissolved into a coughing fit that left her gasping. "Save your strength," Sullivan urged, finally freeing her wrists. Angry red indentations circled her skin like macabre bracelets. "He's a collector," she continued, seemingly unable to stop now that the words had started flowing. "Shows me pictures, others before me, says I'm special, will last longer." Her eyes darted nervously to the metal chair. Records everything. Sullivan's training kicked in as he assessed her physical condition. Beyond the visible injuries, her extreme thinness and pallor suggested dehydration and malnourishment. Her right ankle appeared swollen, possibly broken or severely sprained. "Can you walk?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. Grace shook her head. "He did something to my ankle when I tried to run. 2 weeks ago. That's when I sent Max." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the puppy. "I didn't know if he'd make it, or if anyone would understand." "You did the right thing," Sullivan assured her, making a quick decision. "I'm going to carry you out of here. We need to move quickly." As he gently lifted Grace into his arms, she weighed almost nothing, a ghost of the person she had been before her captivity. The puppy stayed pressed against her, unwilling to break contact after their separation. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens penetrated the basement walls, backup finally approaching. Sullivan felt a moment of relief as he started toward the stairs, Grace cradled protectively against his chest. Then they heard it. The unmistakable sound of a car door slamming shut outside, followed by footsteps on the gravel path approaching the house. Time froze as that car door slammed, a sound that transformed Grace's face from relief to primal terror in an instant. Sullivan had seen many expressions of fear in his career, but never one that spoke so clearly of monsters made flesh. Grace's fingers dug into his arm with surprising strength for someone so weakened by captivity, her nails breaking skin through his uniform sleeve. "He's back," she whispered, her voice barely audible yet somehow filling the entire basement. "Please don't let him take me again." Max shifted from exhausted companion to guardian in seconds, his small body tensing as he positioned himself between the stairwell and Grace. The low, rumbling growl emanating from his tiny frame seemed impossibly deep, a warning that despite his size, he would fight to protect his owner. Sullivan's mind raced through tactical scenarios with machine-like efficiency. The basement offered minimal cover and only one exit, the same stairs the captor would descend. He glanced at his watch, 11:57 p.m. Backup was still 5 minutes out, possibly longer. The cramped space would make a confrontation dangerous, especially with Grace unable to move quickly due to her injuries. "Grace, listen to me carefully," Sullivan whispered, holstering his weapon to free his hands. He quickly removed his tactical vest and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Stay behind me at all times. If anything happens to me, this has my locator beacon. Backup is coming, but we need to buy time." The footsteps above grew louder, deliberate. Not the cautious steps of someone who suspected an intruder, but the confident stride of someone returning to what they considered their domain. Each footfall sent a visible shudder through Grace's body. "He likes to talk before he hurts me," she whispered, eyes fixed on the ceiling as dust drifted down with each step. "He records everything, says it's for his collection." Sullivan positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs, angling his body to provide maximum coverage for Grace while maintaining a clear sightline to the doorway above. With practiced movements, he drew his service weapon again, holding it in a low, ready position that would allow for quick response without immediately escalating the situation. "The cameras," Grace hissed urgently. "He'll know we're here." The realization struck Sullivan. The security system they'd discovered upstairs meant the captor might already know they were waiting. The tactical disadvantage made his stomach tighten, but his expression remained calm, his breathing controlled. He tapped his radio twice, the department's silent signal for imminent threat, hoping the signal would reach through the thick basement walls. The footsteps stopped directly above the basement door. A key rattled in the lock. "Grace," Sullivan whispered without turning. "Who is he?" Her voice trembled as she replied, "Detective Hayward, Homicide Division, Downtown Precinct." The shock hit Sullivan like a physical blow. Alan Hayward, a decorated officer with 20 years on the force, someone Sullivan had shared coffee with just last month during a departmental training. The implications cascaded through his mind: access to police resources, knowledge of investigation protocols, ability to monitor police communications. The door at the top of the stairs swung open, flooding the stairwell with harsh light. "Police! Don't move!" Sullivan called out, his voice steady despite the revelation. "Detective Hayward, I have a weapon trained on the stairwell. Place your hands on top of your head and descend slowly." A chuckle echoed down the stairs, casual, almost friendly. "Jake? Jake Sullivan? Well, this is awkward." Hayward's voice carried the same easy confidence Sullivan remembered from briefings, except now it chilled his blood. The familiar tone made this betrayal all the more horrifying. This wasn't a monster from the shadows, but someone who had sworn the same oath to protect and serve. "Backup's already on the way, Alan," Sullivan called up, deliberately using the first name to establish their connection, while his mind calculated angles and distances. "This ends now. Let's walk out of here together." "You know, I actually respected you, Sullivan," Hayward replied, taking the first step down. His shoes came into view, polished department issue impeccably maintained. Always so by the book, so predictable. Though I have to admit, not waiting for backup was an interesting deviation from your usual approach. Sullivan adjusted his stance, finger resting alongside the trigger guard of his weapon. 26 days, Alan. You kept her here for 26 days. 27, actually. She's special, this one. Most don't last nearly as long. Hayward descended another step, his legs now visible. Did she tell you about the others? I keep their photos, a reminder of those special moments. Grace whimpered behind Sullivan, and Max's growl intensified. Sullivan could feel Grace trembling against his back, could sense her fighting against memories too horrible to imagine. I know about the others, Sullivan bluffed, needing to keep Hayward talking until backup arrived. We found your trophies. Another step down revealed Hayward's torso, department-issue sidearm holstered at his hip, badge glinting on his belt. No, you didn't. But it was a good try, Jake. Stalling won't change anything. She's mine. I found her, I chose her, and I decide when she leaves. The basement air grew heavy with tension as Hayward took another step down, his full form now visible in the stairwell. A man Sullivan had passed in hallways, had trusted as a colleague. His expression was eerily normal, as though they were meeting at a crime scene rather than inside one of his making. You have no idea how long I've gotten away with this, Hayward said, his hand drifting casually toward his weapon. How many times I've heard about my own cases in briefings and offered to help. Did you know I volunteered to lead the task force if another girl went missing? I'm very thorough, Jake. Very patient. Sullivan's radio crackled faintly, a signal that backup was near. Hayward's eyes flicked toward the sound, and in that instant, Sullivan knew the standoff was about to explode into violence. That fleeting distraction, a fraction of a second when Hayward's eyes darted toward the radio, became the moment that would define the rest of Officer Sullivan's life. In the heartbeat that followed, 3 lives hung in perfect balance. Grace's behind him, trembling against his back, Max's tiny form, teeth bared in defiance, and his own, finger sliding to the trigger as Hayward's hand moved with practiced efficiency toward his weapon. Sullivan made his choice. The gunshot echoed through the basement, reverberating off concrete walls that had witnessed too many horrors. But it wasn't Sullivan who fired. Max had lunged forward with unexpected ferocity, clamping his jaws around Hayward's ankle. The detective's shot went wild, embedding itself in the ceiling as he stumbled backward, cursing in pain and surprise. Sullivan seized the momentary advantage, tackling Hayward with the full force of his body. The 2 men crashed into the surveillance equipment, monitors shattering on impact. Grace's scream pierced the cacophony as they grappled on the floor, Hayward's strength surprising Sullivan. Despite his tactical training, Sullivan found himself momentarily pinned, Hayward's forearm crushing against his windpipe. You have no idea what you've done, Hayward snarled, his face contorted with rage. All pretense of professional courtesy vanished. We could have kept this quiet. Department takes care of its own. Sullivan's vision began to darken at the edges, but a blur of movement caught his peripheral vision. Max again, this time leaping onto Hayward's back, distracting him just long enough for Sullivan to break free. In one fluid motion, Sullivan flipped their positions, driving his knee into Hayward's sternum while securing his wrists. Alan Hayward, you're under arrest, Sullivan gasped, the formal words feeling strangely inadequate for the moment. For kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault. He continued reciting the Miranda warning automatically, his voice steadying with each word as footsteps thundered down the stairs. 3 officers burst into the basement, weapons drawn, freezing momentarily at the tableau before them, their fellow officer restraining a detective, a severely injured woman cowering against the wall, and a small dog standing guard between them. Sullivan, what the hell? Officer Chen began, but stopped short as his flashlight beam illuminated Grace's bruised face and the restraints on the chair. Secure the suspect, Sullivan ordered, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. And get medical down here immediately. As they handcuffed Hayward, the detective's expression shifted from rage to a chilling calm. You think this ends with me? He whispered, loud enough for only Sullivan to hear. There are others who appreciate my collection. They'll come for her. Sullivan leaned close, his voice equally low. "Let them come. I'll be waiting." The paramedics arrived with efficient urgency, their professional demeanor faltering only briefly as they took in the basement's grim purpose. Sullivan stood back, watching as they assessed Grace's injuries, murmuring quietly among themselves about dehydration, malnutrition, and multiple untreated fractures. "Sir," one paramedic said, approaching Sullivan while her colleagues prepared Grace for transport. "She's asking for you." Sullivan knelt beside the stretcher, carefully taking Grace's outstretched hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip surprisingly strong. "Max," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "Please don't let them take him to the shelter. He saved my life." "I'll take care of him," Sullivan promised without hesitation, surprising himself with the certainty he felt. "You focus on getting better." As they carried Grace up the narrow stairs, Sullivan found Max pressed against his leg, trembling now that the danger had passed. He carefully lifted the exhausted puppy, cradling him against his chest, where Max immediately nestled his head beneath Sullivan's chin. Captain Rivera arrived as dawn approached, the first hints of daylight filtering through boarded windows. The house had transformed into a full crime scene, technicians documenting everything methodically. Sullivan sat on the front steps, Max asleep in his lap, providing his statement for the third time. "You know Internal Affairs will have questions," Rivera said, his weathered face grave. "A decorated detective in custody. Accusations like this. It's unprecedented." Sullivan nodded. "There's evidence beyond what we've found here." He mentioned others, a collection. "Those photos in the drawer upstairs have dates going back years." Rivera's expression darkened. "We'll need to reopen every case Hayward ever touched." He paused, studying Sullivan with a mixture of concern and pride. "This isn't going to be easy for you, Jake. The department has a way of making life difficult for officers who expose corruption." "I know," Sullivan said simply, his hand absently stroking Max's head. "Take some time off," Rivera suggested. "Mandated leave after a shooting is standard anyway. Get your head straight before the storm hits." Sullivan looked down at the sleeping puppy, thinking about the unlikely chain of events that had brought them together. "I think I'll need to go shopping first," he said. "Dog food, a bed, maybe some toys." Rivera's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Never pictured you as a dog person, Sullivan." "Neither did I," Sullivan admitted. "But some things change you." 3 days later, Sullivan stood in the hospital corridor, a small gift bag in one hand and Max's new leash in the other. The nurse had warned him that Grace was still fragile, both physically and emotionally. But when he entered her room, the smile that bloomed across her face contained a strength that transcended her injuries. Max whined softly, tail wagging as Grace extended her bandaged hand toward him. "I brought someone who wanted to see you," Sullivan said, carefully lifting Max onto the edge of the bed where the puppy immediately crawled toward Grace, licking her face with gentle enthusiasm. "You kept him," Grace whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "Just temporarily," Sullivan assured her, "until you're back on your feet." Grace shook her head, still cradling Max. "He belongs with you now. I can see it in the way he looks at you." She reached for Sullivan's hand. "Some bonds are meant to be." A soft September breeze rustles through Sullivan's backyard as Max, now 20 pounds heavier and gleaming with health, chases butterflies across the grass. 6 months have transformed both their lives. The department's newly formed Animal Assistance Protocol now requires officers to document and investigate animal-related incidents with potential human connections. 3 similar cases have already been solved thanks to this policy change. At Grace's rehabilitation center, Sullivan watches her tentative steps with her therapist. The physical scars are healing faster than the psychological ones, but her resilience astounds him daily. Their conversations have evolved from painful recollections to cautious hopes for the future. She's begun volunteering at a domestic violence shelter, using her experience to recognize signs others might miss. The case files on Hayward have revealed 12 previous victims across 3 states. Sullivan keeps their photographs, now evidence numbers rather than trophies, in his mind as motivation during difficult days. Max's extraordinary journey has become a training example at the academy, where Sullivan occasionally speaks about intuition and unconventional evidence. In the shadow of that terrible house, they found something unexpected, a reminder that even in our most desperate moments, the universe sometimes conspires to place the right messenger at the right doorstep at exactly the right time.